Smoke rises once again in the Middle East. Images of war flash constantly across our news screens, in the artillery fire of Gaza, in the conflicts of the West Bank, in the disputes over Jerusalem's Temple Mount. We witness this millennia-old strife, still unfolding today. It extends beyond politics and military concerns. It delves into deep-rooted conflicts of faith and culture. The strife in this land seems endless, yet this conflict, spanning thousands of years, traces back to an ancient family story. Genesis records this promise that changed human history. The Lord said to Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This promise unfolded throughout history, forming two distinct lines of faith. Heritage, one through Isaac, continuing to today's Jewish people, the other through Ishmael, developing into today's Arab nations. The account in Genesis 12 reveals. When God chose Abraham, he gave three promises: the promise of land, the promise of descendants, and the universal blessing. This promise became a great turning point, yet the interweaving of human weakness with divine plans has created countless ripples through history. When Abraham and Sarah tried to fulfill God's promise through human methods, a complex family conflict gradually evolved into national opposition. This ancient story teaches us human doubt and impatience often bring lasting wounds. Yet God's plan never changed. Behind this ongoing conflict, we see humanity's struggle and God's heart for all nations. When we return to the biblical perspective, perhaps in these ancient records, we can find wisdom to resolve contemporary conflicts. For God's promise to Abraham was not just for one nation's welfare, but that all peoples on earth would be blessed through him. This broader vision may be the revelation we need most today. On the plains of Mesopotamia stood an ancient prosperous city called Ur. It was a center of moon god worship, a gathering place of merchants and flourishing civilization. Abraham and his family lived here. Genesis 12 records, "The Lord suddenly appeared to Abraham, calling him to leave his country, his people, and his father's household, to go to the land God would show him." This was an astounding call, requiring him to leave behind all familiar and comfortable life, to embark on an unknown journey of faith. When Abraham left Ur with his household, he was leaving behind more than a comfortable life, but an entire flourishing civilization. They carried limited possessions, led their livestock, brought their servants, setting out on a long journey. What extraordinary faith and courage this required! Yet God's call came with wonderful promises. "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing to others." These three promises reveal God's grand plan, not just concerning one person's destiny, but to bless all humanity. Abraham responded to God's call with action. Genesis 12:4 states, "Abraham went as the Lord had told him." Behind this simple statement lies extraordinary faith. At 75 years old, Abraham took his wife Sarah and nephew Lot, left the prosperous city of Ur, journeying toward an unknown promised land. Yet the test of faith was just beginning. Year after year, God's promise seemed to remain unfulfilled. Abraham and Sarah remained childless. In an era when numerous offspring meant blessing, the burden of childlessness was overwhelming. Genesis 15 records, Abraham poured out his confusion to God. "You have given me no children. How will your promise be fulfilled?" God led him outside his tent, asked him to count the stars in the sky, promising descendants as numerous as the stars under the starlit sky. Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This moment became humanity's model of faith. Romans 4 records, "Abraham believed in the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Against all hope, he, in hope, believed. His faith endured through trials, growing stronger in the waiting. This gives us profound inspiration. Though God's promises may be delayed, they never fail. His plans always unfold at the most beautiful moment. In Abraham's story, we see a crucial spiritual principle. God often displays his power in impossible situations, revealing his glory at human limitations. This is why Abraham is called the father of faith. His life testifies that faith is not a momentary impulse, but continuous trust and waiting. In ancient Near Eastern culture, a family's continuation was paramount. Having children wasn't just about personal happiness, but the survival of the family line. In ancient Near Eastern marriage customs, a wife's social status often related to her fertility. Children born to servants legally belonged to the mistress. While this system maintained family lines, it planted seeds of emotional conflict. The customs of the time allowed a wife to give her servant to her husband. The children would belong to the mistress. This was a widely accepted practice. Genesis 16 records. Sarah had waited 10 years for God's promise. Seeing herself as old, she seemed to have lost hope of bearing children, so she devised a human solution, giving her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abraham. Though this decision aligned with customs, it revealed human weakness in waiting. Sarah reasoned in her heart, "Since the Lord has kept me from having children, I will give my servant to my husband." So she said to Abraham, "Please go to my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." This seemingly reasonable suggestion revealed hidden doubt about God's promise. Abraham listened to his wife's suggestion. This decision brought unexpected consequences. When Hagar became pregnant, her attitude underwent a subtle change. She began to despise her mistress. This shift in attitude created great turbulence in the family. Genesis 16 records, Sarah said to Abraham, "I am wronged because of you. I put my servant in your arms. Now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." These words were full of grievance and anger, also exposing the complexity of human relationships. Abraham, faced with this situation, seemed at a loss. He said to Sarah, "Your servant is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." This response, though ethically correct for that time, did not solve the fundamental problem. Instead, it intensified family conflicts. Sarah mistreated Hagar, and Hagar fled from her. Thus, the harmony of a family was broken. This story shows us, when people try to use their own methods to fulfill God's promises, it often brings unexpected harm. Human impatience and unbelief not only fail to accelerate God's plan, but create new problems. This reminds us, God's promises must be fulfilled in God's way. Human intervention and manipulation only bring more hurt and brokenness in this process. We see everyone has their weaknesses. Sarah lost patience in waiting. Abraham failed to uphold truth in his dilemma. Hagar forgot her place in her success. These reflect the reality of human nature, showing us that we, too, may face such temptations and failures. Yet God's mercy never ceases. Just as this family relationship was breaking, on the road to Shur in the wilderness, there was a spring. It became a refuge for one who was hurt. Genesis 16 records, Hagar encountered the angel of the Lord there, this pregnant Egyptian woman, fleeing alone into the wilderness, her heart full of grievance and despair. In the wilderness solitude, Hagar constantly recalled the past, from being valued to being despised, from favor to exile. Such changes in status brought great torment to her soul. Yet God's care came to her in her most helpless moment. From a highly valued servant, she became a fugitive with nowhere to go. Yet, in this desolate place, the angel of God appeared to her. This was the first recorded instance of an angel appearing to a woman. More remarkably, she was a lowly servant, a marginalized foreigner. The angel of the Lord called her by name. Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going? This simple greeting was full of care and respect. Hagar said, I am running away from my mistress Sarah. She revealed her situation and expressed her inner pain. Genesis 16 records. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. I will increase your descendants so greatly, they will be too numerous to count. This promise amazed Hagar. God not only saw her suffering, but promised her descendants would become a great nation. The angel continued, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. This name means God hears. What a comforting promise in that moment. Hagar experienced God's wonderful presence. She called that spring Bir Lahai Rai, the well of the living one who sees me. This experience shows us what a merciful God he is. He looks upon the lowly and comforts the wounded heart. Hagar obeyed God's instruction and returned to Abraham's household. Soon she gave birth to Ishmael. The birth of this child seemed to bring temporary peace to the family. Abraham was 86 years old when this son was born, seeing God's promise seemingly beginning to fulfill. Yet beneath this peaceful appearance lay a greater storm, for this was not the promised heir, but the result of human effort. God's intention far exceeds human imagination. Through this story he tells us, he is the God who sees the wanderer, the God who comforts the brokenhearted. Even in our darkest moments, his eyes never leave us. Hagar's experience reminds us, God's grace extends to everyone, regardless of status, regardless of racial background. He cares for all with attention. This also prefigures the entire plan of salvation. God would bless all peoples on earth through Abraham's descendants. In Abraham's story, we see God's wonderful work. He not only fulfills his promises, but also cares for human weakness. Genesis 17 records, when Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him again, reaffirming his covenant intention and revealing a more complete plan. Regarding Ishmael, God said, I have heard your prayer. I will surely bless him, make him fruitful, and greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. What expansive grace! Though Ishmael was not the promised heir, God did not ignore him, but gave him special blessings, promising his descendants would become 12 rulers. This prophecy was fulfilled in history. The Arab nations indeed became great. Yet God's promise concerning Isaac was even more special. Genesis 17 records, God said to Abraham, your wife Sarah will bear you a son. You are to name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants. This promise held unique spiritual significance. Isaac was not just a product of miracle, but a fruit of faith, a divine choice, a sign of grace. These two promises reveal the richness of God's plan. He is the God of all nations. His grace extends to all peoples. These two promises show the completeness of God's plan. He cares for both spiritual inheritance and physical needs, fulfilling both eternal covenants and earthly blessings. This shows us that God's work is always perfect and comprehensive. Genesis 17 reveals to us God's promise to Ishmael, centered on earthly blessings, multiplication, and prosperity. becoming a great nation, while the promise to Isaac, Keru, Seber, included spiritual privileges, inheriting the covenant, continuing the plan of redemption. This distinction was not discrimination, but God's sovereign arrangement to fulfill his greater plan. Galatians 4 uses this as an allegory to explain the relationship between law and grace, revealing the mystery of God's redemption plan. In these dual promises, we see God's faithfulness and mercy. He cares for both Abraham's firstborn and the heir of the covenant. This reminds us God's intention is always complete. He never forgets anyone. History has witnessed the fulfillment of these dual promises. Ishmael's descendants multiplied and grew strong in the Arabian Peninsula, becoming powerful nations. Isaac's descendants, though fewer in number, became the lineage through which the Messiah would come, carrying the weight of God's redemption plan. These two threads have continued to extend through human history, forming today's Jewish and Arab nations. Though these two nations often conflict, they are both under God's care, both within God's plan. This reminds us, God's works are higher than human understanding. His plans far exceed our imagination. In him there is no partiality and no forgetting. Each group has its unique role, all under his providence. This truth gives us hope and wisdom, teaching us to view relationships between different groups through God's eyes. For in God's kingdom, there is a place for every tribe and nation. Shortly after, God reaffirmed these dual promises. His wonderful work was about to be revealed. Genesis 21 records, at the time God had promised, Sarah indeed became pregnant and bore a son. This was a miraculous moment. Sarah at 90 gave birth to Isaac. This name means laughter, for God had brought laughter to Sarah. Abraham received a son at 100 years old. What amazing grace this was when Isaac was born. The whole household was filled with joy. Servants rejoiced. Neighbors gave praise. This was a testimony of miracle, a reward of faith. Yet behind the joy lay an even greater test. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. This moment of laughter did not come easily. It came after long waiting, finally seeing God's promise fulfilled. Yet this joy was not to last. Soon it was overshadowed. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. At this celebration, Sarah saw Hagar's son Ishmael mocking young Isaac. This mocking was not innocent play, but carried contempt. Hebrews 11 tells us this was persecution, for Ishmael knew Isaac's birth threatened his position. This scene pierced Sarah's heart. Genesis 21 records, Sarah said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. This request deeply troubled Abraham, for Ishmael was also his son. He deeply loved this firstborn. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make him into a nation also, because he is your offspring. God's words comforted Abraham and revealed his intention. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, took some food and a skin of water, gave them to Hagar. He set the child on her shoulders and sent them away. What a heartbreaking scene! A young boy and his mother, with simple provisions, walking toward an unknown wilderness. Abraham's heart must have been torn. This was his firstborn son whom he had raised, now forced to separate. Hagar and Ishmael's hearts must have been full of grievance and confusion. Their once honored position now became wanderers in the wilderness. This separation seemed cruel, yet it was a necessary process in God's plan to let the two promises develop separately, each fulfilling God's purpose. This also prefigures a spiritual truth. As Paul states in Galatians, these two sons represent two covenants, one from Mount Sinai, bearing children into slavery, one from the Jerusalem above, bearing children who are free. This story shows us God's plan often unfolds through difficulties. He allows painful separations to accomplish his better purpose. In this process, everyone must pay a price, experience tests of faith, but God remains in control. His promises never fail. Genesis 21 records, Hagar and Ishmael lost their way. In the wilderness of Beersheba, the water in the skin was gone. Walking in the hot wilderness without water supply meant the threat of death. Life in the wilderness was full of challenges: scorching sun, harsh drought. Each day was a test of survival, yet God's provision never lacked. He prepared water sources for them, guided their direction, let them experience grace in hardship. The desperate mother put the child under a small tree, went about a bow shot away. For she said, "I cannot watch the child die." And there she began to weep aloud. What a desolate scene! A mother unable to watch her child slowly die of thirst. Yet in this moment of despair, God's angel called from heaven, "Hagar, what is the matter? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy's cry. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand. I will make him into a great nation." This voice was so familiar. Just as, when she first fled to the wilderness, God's angel appeared to her, giving comfort and promise. Now God watched over her again. Genesis 21 records, God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. This was God's wonderful provision, opening a spring of living water in the wilderness. Hagar quickly filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God's presence changed everything. The threat of death was removed. Despair turned to hope. Genesis says, God was with the boy. As he grew up, he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. Behind this simple record was God's continuous care. Though life in the wilderness was hard, it forged Ishmael's will, making him a strong warrior. He lived in the desert of Paran. His mother got him a wife from Egypt, gradually building his own family. This banished youth, under God's providence, truly became the ancestor of a great nation, just as God had promised. He had 12 sons, each becoming a tribal chief. This experience tells us God's eyes watch over everyone, even in our darkest moments. He will not abandon us. When we have nowhere to turn, He will make a way. When we lose hope, He will rekindle it. The story of Hagar and Ishmael testifies to God's faithfulness. He cares not only for the heirs of the covenant, but also for the marginalized in God's kingdom. Everyone has their place. Every life has special value. This also helps us understand God's will far exceeds our comprehension. He can transform what seems tragic into a testimony of blessing, making a way in the wilderness, opening rivers in the desert. This is the God we trust. He is Lord of all the earth, the God of all nations. His love and faithfulness extends to all who seek refuge in Him. This faithful promise continued to unfold in the lives of two sons under God's providence. The destinies of two sons took different directions, yet both fulfilled God's promises. Genesis 25 records, Ishmael lived in the wilderness, developing extraordinary survival skills. He became an excellent archer, adapting to the harsh desert environment. His 12 sons each became chiefs of their tribes, from the desert of Paran to Shur, from Egypt to Assyria. This vast region became their realm of activity. They established their dwellings by their camps and settlements, living a nomadic life. These two different lifestyles formed distinctly different national characters. Nomadic life cultivated a free-spirited nature. Settled life developed strict laws. These differences continue today, influencing how both nations think. They excelled in desert survival, living by nomadic trade, forming a unique nomadic civilization, while Isaac remained in the Promised Land, inheriting Abraham's estate, living a settled life. He dug wells in the valley of Gerar, farmed in Beersheba, receiving 100-fold blessing. Genesis 26 records, Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and he became rich, grew richer and richer, until he became very wealthy. These two different ways of life formed two different cultural traditions. Ishmael's descendants became the Arab nomadic nations. They lived in tents, roaming the wilderness, living by trade and herding, while Isaac's descendants developed an agricultural civilization. They built cities, cultivated fields, established stable social systems. More importantly, they continued Abraham's faith, guarding God's promises. Genesis records, God established his covenant with Isaac, promising to fulfill the oath made to Abraham, to make his descendants as numerous as the stars, to give all lands to his offspring, and through his seed all nations would be blessed. This spiritual inheritance gave Isaac's descendants a special mission. They were to be a blessing to all nations, to witness to the one true God. The formation of these two nations reveals the richness of God's plan. He turned a family story into a significant chapter of human history in the wilderness. Ishmael's descendants built powerful tribes, known for freedom and valor in the Promised Land. Isaac's descendants inherited the covenant, marked by faith and law. Though these nations shared one source, by God's arrangement, they took different paths. Their story tells us God gives each group different gifts, different mission, different blessings, but all within his plan, all working for his glory. An ancient family story, continuing to extend through history's river, forming a crucial part of today's world pattern. Ishmael's descendants developed into the Arab nations. They inherited their ancestors' nomadic traditions in the vast desert, building a brilliant civilization. Later, the rise of Islam united this nation further, creating glorious empires in history. While Isaac's descendants became the Jewish nation, they held fast to God's covenant. Through historical changes, maintaining their unique faith and culture, though experiencing exile and dispersion, never losing their identity. These two nations of common origin, due to differences in faith and culture, have often conflicted throughout history, especially over the ownership of the Promised Land, creating deep divisions in modern society. We see many efforts toward reconciliation. Government-level peace talks, cultural exchanges by civil organizations, dialogue attempts by religious leaders, all paving the way for peace. Though the path is difficult, it is full of hope. Genesis 17 records, God promised to give the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. This promise became an important basis for modern Israel's establishment. Yet Arabs equally view this land as their ancestral home. This creates a complex situation: territorial disputes, refugee issues, security threats, religious conflicts. These problems intertwine, forming the greatest challenge to Middle East peace. Yet from a biblical perspective, this situation is not without solution, for God's promise to Abraham was to make him the father of many nations, to bless all peoples on earth through him. This broader vision points the way to reconciliation. Isaiah 19 prophesies, "There will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. The Assyrians will go to Egypt, and the Egyptians to Assyria. The Egyptians and Assyrians will worship together." This is a beautiful picture of peaceful coexistence, suggesting future reconciliation is possible in modern society. We see many peace efforts: religious dialogue, cultural exchange, economic cooperation, people-to-people contact, all paving the way for reconciliation. Though the road ahead remains difficult, we see hope in the Bible, for God is the God of peace. He turns enemies into friends, makes walls into bridges. This reminds us, when dealing with ethnic conflicts, to transcend narrow positions, to see God's greater plan. Romans 11 tells us, "How deep are the riches of God's wisdom and knowledge. His judgments are unsearchable, his paths beyond tracing out." Our responsibility today is to live out God's will in this context. Pursue peace, uphold justice, show mercy, for this was God's call to Abraham and his commission to us. Let us be peacemakers in conflict, seek consensus amid opposition, sowing seeds of love amid hatred. Thus we can see Abraham's story is not just a historical record, but a reminder and hope for today. When we review Abraham's story, we easily discover God's intention. His purpose in choosing Abraham was not to create division, but to bless all nations. The promise in Genesis 12 reveals God's grand plan of redemption. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. What a wonderful intention. Matthew 5-9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." This is the Lord's teaching and God's call to us. In today's world, we need such reminders even more. Peace is not a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of strength. Reconciliation is not a compromise, but a choice of wisdom. Achieving reconciliation requires concrete action. We must learn to see from others' perspectives, understand others' situations, eliminate prejudice through education, end misunderstanding through interaction. This requires time and patience, but this is what pleases God. Ephesians 2 records, "Christ Jesus himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall." This gives us hope and direction on a practical level. We need the following steps. First, recognize our identity. We are all Abraham's descendants, all within God's promise. Second, learn to listen to others, understand their suffering and needs, respect their cultural traditions. Moreover, seek consensus through dialogue, build trust through cooperation. This requires courage and wisdom, patience and perseverance. But this is what pleases God. Psalm 133 says, "How good and pleasant it is when brothers live together in unity." This is the scene God desires and the direction of our efforts. We believe, as God reconciled conflicts in Abraham's family, today he can, likewise, in this promised land, achieve peace and reconciliation. For God's promises never change. His love endures forever, his faithfulness through all generations. Let us look up in faith, respond with action. On this path of reconciliation, continue forward until that day we see God's promises fully realized. See enemies become friends. See division become unity. See curses turn to blessings. This is the hope and commission that Abraham's story gives us.